Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome to Red May Day on Red May. We have, as usual, a month of events. Usually they're held live. Well, I won't say they're as usual. They're quite unusual this time, and they will all be held online. We're doing approximately one event a day for the whole month. And just to let you in on the type of events we're showing, uh, our next event, which is tomorrow at 1 p.m., is called House Arrest into the Hidden Abode of Women's Work. And that's with Jenny Brown, Kathy Weeks, Liza Featherstone, and Kathleen Reeves. On Sunday, also at 1 p.m., we have national security after a viral Pearl Harbor with Adam Getachew, Andrew Basevich, Daniel Bessner, Jean Moorfield, and Nikhil Singh. And on Wednesday, the 6th at 1 o'clock, how to liberate technology from capitalism. I'm curious about that myself. Chris Natale, Elias Thorburn, James Steinhoff, Nick Dyer-Witherford, and Wendy Liu. But before we get into today's events, I wanted to sort of tell you, if this is your first time coming to Red May, we have our particular motto is, well, we have two mottos, one riff on red for the month, and the other pretend for a month that the market is not the solution to the problems that the market creates. We don't really have to pretend that during the pandemic, do we? All I have to do is say masks, ventilators, protective gear, and it's quite obvious that the market can't deliver what it claims it can. In order to keep doing this particular event, which is fueled entirely on volunteer power, we have no institutional support whatsoever, since an event, one of whose slogans is "Be a commie for a month," doesn't really rate for institutional support. We depend on the kindness of strangers and everybody who watches and comes to our event. So go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and click on the donate button and share whatever you can so we can keep putting on our anti-market, anti-capitalist, pro-left broadcasts, both live and events, both live and over the air. But now, without further ado, I want to invite you to watch Thinking of the Pandemic, Capital or Life, and I'll introduce you to the moderator, Keaton Slansky, who will introduce our panelists.
Cool. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Appreciate it in the very kind of bizarre digital circumstances we're in. I first off wanted to say that Cinzia Aruzza is not going to be able to join us today. She's under the weather. I hope she's a speedy recovery. She's a wonderful comrade and wish she could join us for this discussion. Fortunately, we do have an amazing panel lined up. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone, and then after that, kick it to the speakers. So first off, we have Asad Haider. Asad is a political philosopher and writer, editor of Viewpoint Magazine, author of Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump, currently professor of philosophy at the New School, and actually currently my professor. Next, we have Sarah Mason. Sarah is a graduate student worker at UC Santa Cruz, studying platform-mediated work, currently writing about the Instacart worker organizing around COVID-19. And she's also co-chair of the Santa Cruz chapter of DSA, which is Democratic Socialists of America, which I assume everyone watching this stream probably knows. Michael Hart is joining us. Michael is a political philosopher and theorist who teaches at Duke University, co-author of many books with Antonio Negri, including Empire, Commonwealth, Declaration, and their most recent book co-written together is Assembly. And then finally, last but not least, we have Rodrigo Nunez. Rodrigo is an organizer and professor in modern and contemporary philosophy at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, author of Organization of the Organizationalists, Collective Action After Networks, and Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Organization, which is forthcoming from Verso. So yeah, amazing panel lined up. I'm gonna start this off in the order through which I read. So I'm gonna kick it to Assad to start things off. We're gonna go for about 10 minutes for each panelist. So Assad.
Thank you, Keaton. Thank you, everyone who's joining. It's been my privilege to have participated in Red May from the beginning, and it's a very good sign to see that not even the pandemic can stop it. It's an unstoppable force. It's a great honor also to be engaged in a discussion of these urgent topics with a group of comrades and thinkers of this caliber. And including Keaton, who has been an outstanding student and organizer. I regret that Cinzia can't join us, but I recommend that anybody who is hoping to hear from her read her article, which was recently published on Viewpoint about the pandemic. Okay, I will begin the discussion at a general theoretical level. And I hope that the connections to our current specific situation will become apparent, especially through discussion. So I will posit 3 theses on politics, and they will be negative theses. And each will be followed by a counter thesis, which will be a positive thesis. And there will be no synthesis. So there is only partisanship and division. The first thesis is that there is no linear relation between history and revolution. Now, the first sense in which this is to be understood is in the sense of crisis. This is obviously a primary concern for us today. Now, an assumption in much of revolutionary history, especially in the mechanistic theories that predominated in the socialist movement, was that crisis would yield a revolutionary opening. That crises were moments in which revolutions either became possible or inevitable. Now, this view has to be countered by the fact that crises occur cyclically in capitalism and restore the conditions for capitalist accumulation. Crises are a cyclical fact. Now, there was also the theory in the history of the revolutionary movement that crises would accumulate over the history of capitalism and lead ultimately to a collapse. And that this collapse, once again, would be the moment in which a revolution would emerge. Now, what I think we see today, we see in the echo of the Great Depression today, 2 possibilities. First, the resiliency of capitalism, the possibility that there can be a new arrangement of capitalism which is able to overcome the crisis, which is able to avert collapse. And the second is the possibility of total catastrophe, of a catastrophe which is planetary and which capitalism can yield to. Revolution may not be the outcome, and I think it's important to realize this. There is another sense in which there has been a linear relationship theoretically between history and revolution, and that is in the theory of progressive capitalist development. The idea that with the development of capitalism, the concentration of the working class and so on, that there would ultimately be a final showdown in which the expropriators are expropriated. Now, what we see instead is the fact that the everyday struggles, anti-capitalist struggles or struggles which are antagonistic to the employers, are a driving force of capitalist development. That is, that the everyday struggles are incorporated as the motor of development of capitalism. And so I think one risk we see now is a kind of fantasy that there will be a crisis management of the situation provoked by the pandemic, which will restore the possibility of a progressive linear development of capitalism, which will lead us back to the conditions of a smooth and automatic revolution. So this is the overall theory which I want to negate. The counter thesis that I propose is that politics is affirmative. That is, that politics has to be consciously and deliberately posited, not as a utopia, not as a vision or blueprint of a different society, but as a mobilization which affirms the possibility and principle of egalitarianism and emancipation. Emancipation is a positive proposal rather than one which is generated by historical conditions. The vision of a future society, I believe, is inescapable, the imagining and envisioning of a future society, but this is internal to and generated by practical struggles, which come out of the affirmation of an emancipatory politics. The second thesis is that there is no such thing as spontaneity. Now, I mean this at several levels. For one thing, spontaneous struggles that we see, the struggles that are understood to be spontaneous, actually represent various levels of organization, microscopic forms of organization, everyday forms of organization that are constantly there and constantly in practice, specific determinate forms of organization. And so instead of having what end up being these metaphysical debates between spontaneity and organization, we have to recognize that organization goes all the way down. But the other aspect of this point is that I think we have to recognize that politics, and I understand politics in a true sense to be an emancipatory politics, a politics which creates a new possibility that puts the existing order into question. This kind of politics is rare. It is not always taking place. And political practice is not emancipatory by default. So we have to recognize that politics is a specific rare occurrence and that its emancipatory character has to be affirmatively positive. And so this is the counter thesis, which is that politics happens under conditions. It is not just always there. That is, there have to be conditions which make it possible for politics to be a break from what already exists, which says that things can be different, that it is possible for us to live in a different way. And this break has to take a material form. And that material form is a specific organizational form which is adequate to the given political situation. This leads to the next thesis, which is that there is no invariant or automatic form of organization. Another assumption of the orthodox and mechanistic theories in socialist history, which are also repeated today, is that various organizational forms like the party or the union are already given by the social structure, and that particular practices like electoral contestation or workplace organizations are necessarily the form that an emancipatory politics will take. On the other side, we have other theories which are not part of the orthodoxy, but which in a way reproduce that logic, that, for example, mutual aid and so on are necessarily the form that an emancipatory politics should take. But I think that we have to recognize that all of these are specific historical practices which have no single and predetermined outcome. And so the decision about the organizational forms that politics will take is, first of all, not a moral one. It's not one which determines that we are practicing a particular set of moral principles which would apply in every case. There's also not a technical one which just says that this is the this is as though we were building a machine, that this is the way one part connects to the other, and that's just how it works. Rather, I think all of these forms of organization and organizational practices have to be understood in terms of the extent to which they contribute to the building of forces, of political forces, which last beyond particular and ephemeral or transitory struggles. And so rather than, let's say, the kind of moralizing position which would say that this particular political practice realizes some abstract set of principles, the only meaningful ethical standpoint is the one which says These practices contribute to building an organization which can last and contribute to the building of a process of structural transformation. And so this leads to the final counter thesis, which is that politics is experimental. And so we must be open to observing and identifying the new forms which arise and advancing new forms. And I will end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Assad. That, definitely gives us a lot to think about. I'm gonna throw it to Sarah now.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy May Day. First, I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this year's virtual Red May. Thank you, Philip. It's an excellent month of programming, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to think through the challenges and the possibilities of this moment with Assad, Michael, and Rodrigo, and also with all of the comrades who are here via Zoom or on YouTube. So before the COVID crisis, when this panel was first being planned, it was called Organizing the Insurgency. And the idea, as I understood it, was to talk about what organizational forms were appropriate to this moment. So the vanguard party, the horizontality of Occupy, the mass political party. When the title of the panel was changed in light of COVID to Capital or Life, the organization question felt all the more pressing, since it is the organization question that will likely decide the dilemma, capital or life. So what organizational form is appropriate for this moment? Or perhaps the better question is, what organizational form or forms are already emerging, flowing out of the swell of self-activity currently taking place around the country and the world? What are their possibilities, and how do we harness them to determine whose crisis this will ultimately be, theirs or ours, which is really just another way of saying capital or life. The upsurge in work stoppages, walkouts, mutual aid efforts, and tenant organizing has been nothing short of remarkable. Since the widespread lockdown began, there have been at least 150 strikes, many of which have been organized by workers without collective representation in sectors with low union density. But while COVID-19 has thrust workers in some sectors into an explosive wave of confrontations with capital and the state, organized entire buildings of tenants virtually overnight, and kicked off a series of hunger strikes, protests, and riots in prisons and immigrant detention centers, for others, the organizing and collective action that existed prior to the lockdown has been completely upended and disoriented by the crisis. As Cinzia Arruzza rightly puts it in her recent article for Viewpoint, which Assad also mentioned, quote, "The present conjuncture is filled with tensions and contradictions. Time is out of joint, both dense with events and suspended." There is much to say about the density of events, but I want to try to talk about the suspension and the challenges it poses too. When my workplace, UC Santa Cruz, was shut down, graduate student workers like myself were in the midst of an almost 4-month-long wildcat strike. Our labor action began as a grading strike in December, when hundreds of teaching assistants and graduate student instructors refused to submit final grades for the fall quarter in mass. We were demanding a cost of living adjustment, an additional $1,400 per month to bring us out of rent burden. In February, we escalated into a full-blown teaching strike. For several weeks, picket lines wrapped around campus entrances, routinely shutting down the flow of traffic. Picketers faced off against heavily militarized police. 17 were arrested. Entire departments, including faculty and lecturers, participated in the full work stoppage. Undergraduate students, similarly faced with skyrocketing rents and crushing debt, identified with our struggle. They raised their own demands and led their own actions, often using the picket line as an organizing space. At the end of February, nearly 100 graduate student workers were fired for their participation in the strike. On other campuses, the firings catalyzed an outpouring of rallies and protests. In early March, efforts to join the strike ramped up at UC Santa Barbara, UC Davis, UC San Diego, UCLA, and Berkeley. As the strike began to spread to other campuses throughout the UC system, the reality of COVID-19 abruptly plucked us out of orbit and flung us into a seemingly pathless abyss. Like millions of workers around the country and around the world, we were effectively locked out, alone, isolated from one another, yet collectively stunned. Overnight, the militant sociality of the picket line and the weekly general assemblies evaporated. The basis of our organization, which was our collective activity, was no longer possible, at least not in the same way. As we continue to organize for a broader, sanctioned UC-wide strike, a question arises, one that many other non-essential workers may soon have to answer. What does a strike without a work site look like, and how do we organize it? With many of us now dispersed throughout the world, working asynchronously, it is an interesting question. Here, I think lessons drawn from the labor struggles of low-wage, platform-mediated workers like Uber and Lyft drivers and Instacart shoppers can be useful. For those of us now suddenly working remotely, almost exclusively online, any strike action will essentially amount to logging off collectively, a labor action that platform workers are well-versed in. What is more difficult to think through is the kind of practical activity or organizational work that will make such a collective refusal possible, not to mention the certain likelihood of layoffs and furloughs in the academic sector. And this is something that we're currently struggling to figure out. If we borrow again from platform workers, coordination over signal groups and WhatsApp chats will perhaps become more central, as will phone and text banking and digital communication like email. One of the most promising stories of the possibilities of email-based organizing comes from an article published in Business Insider. Last month, Saturn Management, a property management company in LA, sent out an email to 300 tenants across 24 properties. The correspondence, according to one tenant, read, quote, "Rent is still due. File for unemployment if you need to. The emergency moratorium only delays an eviction," end quote. Mistakenly, the property manager did not blind copy the tenants, which instantly put them in communication with one another, and then in communication with the LA Tenants Union. Over email, they began organizing a rent strike across multiple buildings. That rent strike is slated to begin today. Under these conditions, virtual space emerges as a more serious venue for organizing, with Facebook groups springing up for tenants, grocery store and warehouse workers, and the unemployed, 30 million of whom have applied for benefits in the last 6 weeks. When we talk about the crisis of COVID-19, we are never just talking about the virus. We are talking about the ways in which the virus compounds the ongoing crises of capitalism, the effects of which are never evenly distributed or experienced, and how the demands of capital further compound the crisis of COVID-19. An adequate response must be one capable of engaging these multiple layers. What seems to be the primary challenge is how to organize such a response, how to, under these frustrating conditions, link up the powerful but relatively atomized actions and organizing efforts currently taking place and forge them into a coherent, durable, and formidable challenge to the rule of capital. As Assad remarked, crisis does not necessarily yield revolution, nor does it inevitably lead to collapse. There are no guarantees, no automatic outcomes, but there is movement, and we should throw ourselves into it to assert a radical and emancipatory politics whenever and wherever possible. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. Great. So from there, we're going to head to Michael Hart.
Thanks, Keaton. And I too like to thank the organizers and wish everyone a happy May Day. I wish that we could be together in the streets somewhere rather than being this as we should be from it. I wanted to take up some of, or at least think through part of Sarah's examples, and then also really start from Assad's third thesis. And so if those of you, A, who weren't on the listening already then, or B, weren't taking notes, Assad's third thesis was that there's no invariant form of organization. And I guess what you know, the part of the prompt for our whole session is ask what next after the crisis. And it seems to me here is one part of it, only addressing, of course, one small part of it. It seems to me that one thing that's next is necessarily an antagonistic labor movement, but one, not the traditional labor institutions. That is, not simply labor unions of wage workers organized by sector, not only that. So let me, before getting to what would be the alternative, yeah, as you can see, what I mean by, I think Assad's reasoning about no invariant form of organization, in part I'm trying to think what would, or what does, I'm not thinking this is invented from new, a labor movement look like that is not only based on the organization of wage workers by sector. It's true that in the COVID crisis, one of the things that's been revealed, I mean, one of the remarkable things about the crisis is how many things that we already knew were being revealed. You know, things, it's sort of like, it's like that chemical put on photographic paper where you have the latent image that's now made prominent, something like that, visible. You know, it's revealed all kinds of inequalities based on class, rich and poor, racial inequalities, etc. But it's also revealed aspects of the labor force, you know, especially through the designation of what's essential and what's not essential, and the who is able to be submitted to danger and who not. In some ways, it's what do you call it? Intersection between danger and exploitation. One of the things we've seen are different sectors have become more prominently in view during the crisis. Certainly logistics sectors, Amazon, FedEx, even grocery workers, we could consider part of that. Various aspects of workers in phases of social reproduction, healthcare, elder care, education. And these, you know, the education struggles that Sarah's pointing out around higher education seem to be one aspect of this. I think these are super important that we've seen the, in some ways, still embryonic struggles of Amazon workers, of FedEx workers, and then healthcare workers even more so. I think these are super important and will continue. There's partly, like Sarah was saying, one question about, in various of these sectors, the difficulty of organizing, especially along traditional lines. But what I wanted to reinforce is that one shouldn't only think of this in terms of waged workers. We know very well that unwaged workers and precarious workers, even if we're only thinking about social reproduction, are in some ways a majority way that kind of labor happens. Social reproduction, as we well know, is largely conducted by unwaged labor, largely based in gender terms, largely by women, often by racially defined migrant labor. And so one result that one could think about this, let's say one conclusion one should come to when thinking about this, is that a labor movement coming out of this must be able to include the unwaged, the unemployed, the precariously employed. So the model for thinking about, and this is just what I wanted to propose as an element of discussion or a possibility, is the model of social unionism or social movement unionism. By that, I mean, or I understand, I mean, I could point to historical examples that I'm thinking of, but what I'm thinking of primarily is a cross between traditional labor unions and social movements. across that it manages to combine demands for wage and safety justice with demands for democracy, or rather that combine concrete reformist demands with transformational demands, and also are able to combine the inherited organizational structures of traditional labor unions and of social movements. One good example of this in the contemporary, seems to me, and this is, I'll just stop with this really, are the experimentations of neonamenos, especially around the tactic of the women's strike or the social strike. You know, when I say social unionism, in some ways I'm thinking about what do we call this, maybe a syllogism, from a recognition that production is social production and reproduction, therefore requires social unionism as a form of organization, and that leads to social strike. So thinking these three together, it seems to me that neonamenos is one of the places that I know that has most experimented with the tactic of the strike conceived in social terms. By that I mean both in factories and workplaces and outside of them. For a while, at least, part of this is a couple of years ago that neonamenos, at least in Argentina, was proposing as a question for each group to ask, what does it mean to strike where you are? You know, so that from the factory, what does it mean to strike? From the unwaged domestic work in the home, what does it mean to strike? From the community movement, what does it mean to strike? And I think that this this kind of experimentation is a way of working out what that model of social unionism that I was proposing could mean. Yeah, so in general, maybe I'll just come back to the general thing. I mean, so I don't mean to blame you with this, Asad. Maybe you mean something totally, but I would take from your third negative proposal that one shouldn't consider that we have to choose among the various traditional forms of organization, assuming that they're transhistorical, always good in the same way, that we have to rather experiment with, I think that was the positive part of your third one, about experimentation. We have to experiment what labor organizing can mean in a context in which we understand labor in a much broader sense than just the wage, just organized by sector. And then maybe this is something that's moving differently than what you're intending, Asad, that the possibilities of organizing within social movements, rather than being an alternative to labor organizing, could be thought or practiced together. And that's, in short, what I'm intending for this term of social unionism or social movement unionism. Okay, I'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. I think that's definitely something we'll kind of dig back into after Rodrigo goes. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Rodrigo now.
Well, thank you, Keaton. Happy May Day, everyone. I'm really glad we managed to make this work out in the end after so many emails going back and forth between me and Philip and Sean. And I would like to start. I'd like to make my opening statement just based on two very basic points. The first one is, and it coincides with something that Asad has already said to some extent. This is the second once in a lifetime event we've experienced, which says a lot about the present level of unpredictability of the global system. And as with, once the pandemic began, we started seeing a certain kind of analysis that was saying, well, now people will finally see that healthcare for all is necessary, or now people will finally see, now the mask has fallen, etc. But I think the lesson we should draw from the last time we've experienced once in a lifetime event, response from 2011 onwards, is precisely that we cannot take subjective transformation or processes of political recomposition for granted. It's not the virus who's going to do this for you. It's not the virus that's going to pull off the mask from capitalism. It's not the virus that's going to make people see things. It's not the virus that's going to start a process of political recomposition. It's us or no one. If we don't do it, it's highly unlikely that anyone else will. So yes, of course, crises create opportunities, but one of the things I certainly believe I underestimated 10 years ago or 12 years ago was the extent to which market discipline is entrenched in people's everyday lives, the extent to which that has become second nature to most people, and the power of crisis itself as a disciplinary mechanism. What always comes to my mind is a poll about the labor reform that the Temer government introduced in Brazil in 2017, in which people were asked, do you think you're going to be worse? Do you think you're going to be worse off after this reform? And the majority of people said yes. Do you think this reform is necessary? The majority of people said yes. So many people have, because this is these huge epochal crises, but generally in people's lives. Generally in people's lives, many people have naturalized the disciplinary disciplinary element of both the market generally and crises. Or they have naturalized that the idea that life is made of what Isabelle Stengers and Philippe Pinard called infernal alternatives, such as, for example, you have to choose between protecting yourself and your family from the virus or protecting your income. Bolsonaro has openly declared that in Brazil, and many poor people have reacted to that by saying, well, finally someone who understands, because guess what? Under capitalistic conditions, this is true. They are being forced to make this choice. So that would be the first point. Do not take anything for granted. Whatever we get out of this will be whatever we have put into it. That is not a linear proportion between the effort we make and the outcome we get. Thankfully, we have the chance of getting a non-linear output from this. But the fact that the effect can be much larger than the effort that we can put into it shouldn't function as an excuse for us not to do our best. The second point is this crisis is playing out already on two fronts, I believe. The first is obviously the front of social reproduction. It is a crisis of social reproduction with mass unemployment, people defaulting on private debt, etc., etc. A crisis of solvency, lots of things that directly threaten people's conditions of reproduction. The other front is the front of government responses, primarily in the form of fiscal stimulus. And my point here would simply be, we cannot afford to choose either of those fronts. We cannot afford to choose between those fronts. We have to be active on both. On the level of social reproduction, obviously, because mutual aid projects will be absolutely imperative at this point, so that people can face the direct threat to their conditions of reproduction that the pandemic imposes. But whatever world we will get out of this crisis at the other end is being decided now to a large extent by the nature of government response. a very simple example of that would be if we get a huge fiscal stimulus going into the oil industry, then we can forget about meeting the target that was set by the IPCC for this decade of reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 45% on 2010 levels by the end of the decade, if we are to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius in global warming. So we need, and besides, well, obviously the capitalist class has very, in many places, has very readily hit the Keynesian panic button. Now, we will be facing calls for even more austerity once this is over. So we have to build now the social capacity to push back against these calls for austerity down the line. So we cannot choose. We must invest in both those fronts now and use mutual aid as a way of building a social base that can both interfere at the level of government decision-making now, where the fiscal stimulus goes to, and also push back against austerity once the time comes. Which means, just one final point, which means that we also, like Assad suggests, we cannot afford to choose organizational forms in abstract. What we need now is whatever we need to for whatever different jobs we have to do. What we need now is actually an ecology of different organizations that can do all the different jobs that need to be done.
Excellent. Thank you, Rodrigo. I want to dig into this idea of kind of like organizational structure and forms, both in specifically some concepts that Rodrigo, Sarah, Assad have touched on. The idea of mutual aid and, excuse me, sorry, I got distracted by something in the chat. The idea of mutual aid and social reproduction and kind of rent being due right now. Especially in the terms of mutual aid intervening in the government, like I want to touch on this idea of kind of autonomous organizing versus organizational structures that are in place versus organizational structures that will, you know, as Rodrigo just said, kind of like fill in gaps as we go on in this moment. Do we, like, I guess the question I want to pose to the panelists is, when we talk about mutual aid, is it autonomously like responding to a crisis? I know Assad talked about kind of its organizing all the way down. Is that something we agree with? There are some questions from the audience that I will get into in regards to this as well. But I wanted to hear from you guys in just regards to like, when we think of mutual aid, how is that organized? Is that an organizational structure that was around before? Is that something that is a response to a crisis? And what role does that play theoretically in fitting into what a leftist organizational response to this crisis looks like? I don't know, whoever wants to respond to that can go first. Okay, I'm gonna go to Assad then.
Okay, I think there is a distorted discussion today about mutual aid, because there's an idea that workplace organization or organization in political parties is to be counterposed to a practice which is more or less anarchist or something of that kind, which is of mutual aid. And there are even, you know, these critiques which say that mutual aid is not only anarchist but neoliberal, because it transfers responsibility for meeting one's needs onto people rather than extracting it from the state. But this is based on a really distorted understanding of the history of socialist organization. Because what we see if we study socialist history, and we can look directly at the example, at the classic example of the German Social Democratic Party. In the period when it was illegal, the party was able to recruit members and was able to build its organization precisely through mutual aid, through a subculture of mutual aid, which involved co-ops, bicycling clubs, the equivalent of what we will now call CSAs and so on. These were all part of the practice of building a socialist organization. And so I think now the discussion is at a level of abstraction which removes us from the concrete question of organization building. Now, I think certainly mutual aid is absolutely vital in terms of meeting needs that are not being met by the state, that are not being met obviously by the market. But the reason that it's important to engage in these practices is to show that it's precisely the socialist organization which will step in to meet those needs when people are exposed and abandoned. And I think that this is what, this point came up, I believe Michael alluded to this point about experimentation, that, workplace organizing and electoral politics are also experiments when we do them now. When we do them now, those are also experiments. Maybe some of those experiments have failed. The jury is still out, perhaps. But those have to be understood as experiments which are alongside the experiments in mutual aid, all of which have to be evaluated to the extent that they are capable of building lasting organizational forms that can achieve revolutionary change.
Great. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything on the topic of mutual aid? Otherwise, we can go. There's some questions more into organizational form.
I just wanted to say something that is something that Philip has just raised here in the chat, which is there is a very common critique. I suspect it is as common in the US as it is in Brazil among activists, where if you talk about experiments such as those that Assad was just talking about, and you talk about base building, etc., people will respond, well, but how is that different to the idea of the enlightened vanguard that goes to the masses to build their consciousness? And the problem with that critique of organizing or base building or whatever is that only a person who was very bad at base building would attempt that kind of base building that consisted exclusively of you going to people's houses or people's, the places where they gather to lecture them on socialism. Historically, there's always been a mutual aid element to base building. Historically, the two things have always gone together, and the two best examples of that are precisely the Panthers free breakfast program in the US and the practice in Brazil and all over Latin America of liberation theology and the ecclesial based communities. People have, a lot of the time, people are reacting to a very poor idea of like what a small socialist sect would call base building, when actually there is a very rich tradition which is not necessarily, wouldn't even necessarily describe itself as socialist. And in fact, in all sorts of different traditions, you will find very rich traditions of combining base building and mutual aid, and sometimes even political action at the party level.
Great. On that, we have a question that I kind of want to pose to you, Rodrigo, and to everyone on that exact idea of, you touched on organizational ecologies. And you said we need broad organizational ecologies to respond to the current situation. We just talked about some of what that looks like in terms of mutual aid. What are some other hard examples of that organizational ecology? And the question for the audience is, what should we do? I know it's a pretty broad question, but in terms of that, I want to pose that to you and to everyone.
So an example of organizational ecologies.
And then what should we do?
Well, an organizational ecology, I would say that an organizational ecology always already exists. No organization exists on its own. However much many organizations would like to believe that that's the case, it's not actually the case that any organization exists on its own. Also because there is a lot of organization, there is organization going on all the time, which doesn't take any permanent organizational form that we would recognize as such. So there's always an ecology going on. I think the problem, when we talk about the need for building organizational ecologies, what we mean is we need richer organizational ecologies, which I guess would mean basically two things. On the one hand, you need stronger local initiatives, not that they're necessarily exclusively local. They might be federated, they might be part of a national organization, etc. But they have a local base that they can mobilize, that they are in permanent relation to. And the other thing, so you don't have a local, the nodes of your network, of your ecology aren't just like very small groups of individuals scattered all over the place. No, you actually have fairly sizable social bases in different places. The other thing is functional diversification. You have people who do lots of things. So you have people who do labor organizing, both standard and new forms of labor organizing. You have people who do mutual aid. You have people who intervene at the level of local government or state government or federal policy, etc. And more importantly, these people have some kind of, these people are taking each other into account when they're building their strategies, and they have some kind of level of communication among them. I guess the best example we have nowadays of a place where something like that came the closest to happening, where you had a really rich organizational ecology that came out of the 2011 cycle, was Spain. And it's no surprise that it's the one place where eventually some of that 2011 wave found its way into government, with however many difficulties that that might have included. But if you look at the progression from the 15M in Spain until now, you see that they had both those things. They had functional diversification, and they had a movement like the Platform for People Affected by Mortgages, the PAP, which was a movement that managed, both had a policy and a mutual aid element, and managed to mobilize lots of people all over Spain.
Excellent. Thank you. In terms in terms of that, I want to kind of ask, we have two questions here that are for Assad and Michael and also for everyone. I want to ask these questions and then go first to Michael and then let Assad respond, because I feel they're kind of interlinked and we can have a back and forth on this. So the question for Michael is, how does social unionism compare to the party form? And is it a party from below? And then on that, the question for Assad and everyone that we'll go to after that, Michael, you can also address if you want. They say, does the claim that, quote, it's organization all the way down trivialize political organizations? Is it spontaneity, not the responses, is spontaneity not the responses in the gaps and ruptures between organized forms? So Michael, I wanna hear what you have to say in regards to that, and also the question around social unionism and the party form, and then we'll go to Assad and anyone else who wants to have anything to say about it.
If one understands by the party an organizational form for constructing counterpower, then yes, it's a form of the party. I mean, if one understands party simply to mean that lasting and powerful form of organization, yes. But if this is, now it's coming back to something that I think all four of us have been touching on, if by party one means a fixed structure and the repetition of that, then that's not what it seems to me what we're talking about. I think Rodrigo's notion of the ecology of organizational forms is really great, partly because it emphasizes the internal diversity of political organizational movements even. I mean, and it resonates, of course, with the diversity of tactics as a slogan that has, circulated for some decades. And the movements, the internal diversity of organizational forms seems to me a really interesting point. But I would also bring this back, and maybe I'm answering for Assad such a question, so he can correct me, which is that if I guess, like I was saying before, that if one understanding party as a fixed structure that's dictated by past and traditional organization, that negates the kind of experimentation that's necessary, it seems to me that Assad is rightly pointing towards. I have nothing against party if by that one has the possibility for experimentation. If really by party one means, yeah, like I say, some sort of proper form of organization. You respond, Assad. I think you're better for this.
So I think that many things are conflated in the discussion of the party. For one thing, we think of the form of the political party, which is a state apparatus. That is, parties are the apparatuses which participate in the state, in parliamentary contestation, and so on. And then on the other hand, we have the idea of the vanguard party in the Marxist and Leninist traditions. And to conflate these two, I think is now, this is a classic gesture of contemporary social democracy to claim a Leninist basis for the Bernie Sanders campaign or something like that. This is muddled, I believe. So let's distinguish on the one side, the party as a political apparatus, as a state apparatus. In this sense, there are great risks with party organization because it means adopting the bourgeois form of politics. And these practices of politics are the ones which are internal to the capitalist state. And a practice of politics which can go beyond capitalism is one which does not correspond to the logic of the capitalist state. It is a practice which is based in mass organization, rather than the transfer of this mass power to the party representatives. This is the level of thinking about the party as a state apparatus, that we have to criticize that practice of politics and conceive of new practices of politics that are based in mass organization. The second question, is the question of the vanguard party. Now, if the vanguard party is understood to be the elite layer which brings revolutionary consciousness to the working class and then leads it in a revolutionary process, then we have a very ossified kind of understanding of politics which totally precludes experimentation. That is exactly the form of invariant political forms that doesn't allow us to invent political forms that are adequate to our contemporary moment. However, I think we have to interpret what that insight was, the insight underlying the idea of the vanguard party, which was that everyday struggles on their own don't necessarily lead to a challenge to the whole system. They don't necessarily lead to the struggle for political power. And so, I mean, this is what spontaneity meant. Now, of course, what are so-called spontaneous struggles, let's say trade union struggles, they're organized. Unions are organizations. They engage in these everyday struggles for bettering working conditions, better living conditions, and so on. The sense in which it's still meaningful to speak of them as spontaneous is the sense in which the affirmation of emancipatory politics, the idea that the whole way we live can be different, that we can live in a different kind of society, is not automatically given in these struggles, but has to be deliberately proposed. And this is what I mean by the counter thesis that politics happens under conditions. What we should retain from the idea of the party is the idea of the conditions for politics and not the form, the technical form of the party itself.
Excellent. I want to touch on something you said, Assad, as we're talking about the party and the party form. I mean, I think a lot of us can agree in terms to, we're looking right now at organizational forms that you, as you put, are adequate to the contemporary moment, and also that emancipatory politics has to be put forward, has to be deliberate, is not taken as a given in regards to the political project. And as we're talking about the party form, and as you brought up the Bernie Sanders campaign in the current moment, just kind of, I'm really curious to hear what the panelists think in regards to, do we think the party form is remotely inadequate response in this anyway, at least in the United States, in regards to, you know, our parties as forms of even something getting remotely close to the project of emancipatory politics, or in this moment, as the 2020 election is going on, is it something to kind of abandon entirely in the idea of organization? Yes, Saad, I agree with you. I was about to actually throw it to Sarah as well, because we haven't heard from her in a minute. So I want to almost get into exploring the topic of just the usefulness and proclivity of the party form and what that means in the contemporary political atmosphere of an intense crisis and autonomous, radical, emancipatory political organizations taking shape alongside, you know, a kind of almost antiquated bourgeois party. And so, yeah, Assad said he would like to nominate Sarah to speak. I agree in regards to DSA organizing experiences. That's, yeah, the debate around electoral politics, also something I have, yeah. So Sarah, I'd be curious to hear your take on this.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about this. I guess I feel like there was a lot in the lead up to that. Can you frame it more specifically?
Yeah, sorry. Basically just like, what do we think right now as we're talking about organizational forms that can meet the current crisis with a material politics of emancipation, and what the role of the, like, I guess not even the role, but the viability of the party form in its current political moment, what role that plays in our organizing, what role, how much credence we should give to it. And I know Assad just mentioned the kind of links between, like, you know, a lot of us are fresh off the Bernie Sanders campaign and DSA's role in that. And, you know, we all come from debates around even engaging in electoralism and quote unquote bourgeois electoralism. So kind of that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it will be really interesting the way in which this moment has coincided also with the suspension of the Sanders campaign and basically the dissolution of the electoral infrastructure essentially overnight. It's going to be really interesting to see what that is actually capable of transforming into, because I think there was a large contingent in DSA that felt very strongly that electoral work, the work of canvassing, didn't just have to be about electing a candidate, that it could be more expansive, that it could bring people into politics and engage people in different kinds of organizing. And I think it will be, interesting to see whether that actually pans out. I think for those of us who didn't really engage in electoral organizing, but instead focused on organizing that was happening primarily around tenant struggles and organizing the unorganized, we're actually seeing the ways in which that type of organizational activity is in this moment incredibly useful, especially those people who have been involved in tenant organizing. And so I think there are some real lessons to be learned about the ways in which different forms of activity and modes of organization are actually capable of bolstering the kinds of political struggles that we're seeing in this moment in ways that electoral organizing simply cannot, or at least at this point, it's unclear if it can.
Yeah, I think that touches on, kind of to go back to like the viability in regards to relating to did we just lose Michael? The party apparatus. So we just got a question in, well, that's a big question. All right. So I would like to pose the question to then Rodrigo as well, is do you see the relation to the party as an organization? Like, basically, I'm curious, do we see it as something that we should relate to moving forward is it a part of the organizational ecology right now as a radical response to this crisis? And I'd be really curious to hear an international perspective on this, right? Because we just kind of have in America, we have the two parties who are both kind of like ossified and antiquated up in their own kind of sphere that is completely disconnected from any kind of what we would call an organizational ecology in the US. So I'd be curious on both an international perspective and just what your thoughts are on relating to the party structure.
Well, I think it's the way you phrase the question is already indicative of what I think has changed in recent years, in the way people think about the party and pose the question of the party. Because the way you posed the question was, should it be part of an ecology? And that is in itself already a very different way of posing the problem of the party to what used to be within the Marxist tradition, the more traditional way of posing the question of the party, which tended to see the party as the thing that should eventually it was not only the last thing to appear in an ecology, but it was also the thing that was supposed to be what would subsume the ecology at the end. So there was the idea that the party wasn't one part of the ecology like any other party. The party tendentially became the whole ecology, or eventually it was the commanding heights of the party were the commanding heights of the organizational ecology as a whole. I think that has led people for a long time to reacting to that idea, to say, well, we don't want a party, we don't want any of that, because we don't want something that's going to be that's going to subsume the whole ecology. And in recent years, because people have felt the absence of the party, because people after 2011 in the US, in Spain, in several other places, people realized, well, actually we can mobilize thousands of people, we can put lots of people on the streets, but we have no interlocutors on the other side. And so we can't actually turn that power we're manifesting in the streets into any kind of policy change. People have started posing the question of the party differently. They have started to ask themselves, well, okay, there is one function within the ecology that other things can't do. This function of, organizing an electoral presence, of, participating in parliament, etc. Maybe we also need that, but we need that as one part of the ecology that's going to fulfill that function, and not the thing that's going to take over the whole ecology. And maybe the case of Brazil is illustrative here, because Brazil actually built perhaps the very last of the great modern parties in the form of the PT. And the people who built the party still imagined the party as tending towards becoming the whole of the ecology. And when the party fell apart, that left everything else in a very bad position, because it's still the hegemonic part, the hegemonic party in the left. But it's kind of a shell of what it used to be now. So it actually blocks the path of other things that could be emerging.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really interesting perspective in regards to, I mean, yes, that's a good reminder of like the Marxist tradition of the party. And it's really fascinating to look at the ecologies now and the way that everything is kind of rupturing. And as we talked about in regards to like various mutual aid efforts and kind of autonomous or less autonomous organizing, I would be curious, like without that kind of grand, almost narrative of the party leading or kind of conglomerating this ecology, do we see a space, like there's a space for that, and there is kind of a vacuum left over from the absence of this party? And I guess I would pose a question, because Assad kind of brought up like the vanguard or the Leninist line. There is also, a tendency for them to fill that vacuum. But is there do these ecologies, especially in this moment, do they necessitate an overarching I guess body politic like that, right? Do they necessitate a party, or are these autonomous ecologies able to and should remain as an ecology, as separate spheres working together? Yeah, I would be curious to hear people's thoughts on that while we're talking about the party. I would be interested to hear from Michael. I don't think we've heard from him in a minute.
You've never talked about that, have you, Michael?
No, I mean, I think the others have really, treated this in many ways already. I think what you're asking for, Keaton, is to recognize the forms of mediation that are required when one's thinking about a political project in terms of multiplicity. Like that's, or this is just another language, I think, for saying things that we've all been saying. Like when Sarah was describing the different people working within DSA, it seems to me it's one thing to say, and I think it's an important thing, and this goes along with, it seems to me, the experimentation the notion of ecologies, is that there is a multiplicity in this project, a multiplicity that is not, as Rodrigo is saying, in a traditional form subsumable within a an overarching structure, within a whatever directive committee, something like that. But to say multiplicity does then require that there are mechanisms of mediation among the different parts. And so that's what it seems to me like. So one way of having mediation is through a universal mediator of the central committee of the party or something like that. But there are many other forms of mediation that aren't as univocal and are transversal, is maybe the way of saying it. So that's what I was thinking. The helpful thing that you're pointing towards, Keaton, I'm only answering this in very schematic and theoretical terms, is what are the forms of mediation that hold the multiplicity together if it's not unified under a single umbrella? And I think we can point to those in our various practical experiences. You know, that it may be the thing that we've been saying just for a half hour is that that isn't the only model possible of mediating among the multiplicity that one has in a project. And so, I don't know, that's just where I am. Like I say, I'm just answering on a theoretical level, but I think one could fill that in quite easily with the kinds of mediations that exist in each project. Like, I don't know, I mean, you could answer, Keaton, like what are the kind of mediations in DSA between people who are working on the Bernie campaign and people instead, like Sarah was saying, who are working on questions of evictions and et cetera. There are mediations, and it's not because there's some central unifying force that's distributing tasks and having them all fit into one. There are other sorts of transversal mediations.
Yeah, I think yeah, the concept of mediation is yeah, I appreciate the clarification, Michael. That is kind of what I was trying to get at in terms of like I think I'm kind of trying to dig into like where you guys come down on this, right? In terms of like what do we or you think maybe is not necessary, but like what that looks like. I mean, obviously we've seen a lot of mediation in terms of the different kind of autonomous responses and you know, like you said, the Bernie Sanders campaign conglomerating with tenants organizing or cooperating, excuse me. But yeah, I'm just curious as to what form that mediation takes, which is what I was kind of trying to look at in regards to the party. And as right now, and as so many things are rupturing, and there is, you know, there's so many new kind of autonomous like rent strikes and things happening, and people that might not have been involved in organizing in any capacity are getting involved, and you're seeing there's definitely mediation necessary, right? Because you have tenants unions all of a sudden working with people who are being organizers, and then you have organizers that are feeling the need to be a vanguard party and all kinds of things like that. So basically, it's I'm curious if there is an answer to that question that you posed, Michael, of what that mediation looks like. If it's not a party, if it's not, you know, is there anything necessary for that, or is it fine for everyone to just mediate with each other of their own accord, of their own volition in this organizational ecology? Yeah, I would be curious about an answer to that. If there, I know it's a big question. If there isn't one, we have some questions, but if anyone, Rodrigo, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I'd like to use the being Brazilian. I obviously resort to football metaphors every now and then. So I'd like to use the image of what's called in sport positional awareness. In a team sport, you need, or in order to have a good team, you need neither one good player who controls the whole game or several good players who are all doing their own thing. You need an entire team of people who are aware of what everyone else is doing, so they know what they need to do in relation to everything else. So I think the image of the the important thing about the image of the ecology is not so much the imperative to build the ecology, because like I said, an ecology already exists anyway, but precisely to make people think about what they do and what other people do as existing within an ecology, as existing in a space in which people can influence the possibilities of the field of possible actions of each other without even knowing that they exist, simply by acting on an environment that is a shared environment for everyone. So that would be, I wouldn't claim that this would be the solution, but that would be an answer going in the direction of what Michael was proposing. Well, if everyone is trying to, if everyone is aware, if everyone is trying to mediate with one another, that makes a difference. That's not going to make it perfect. It's not going to, doesn't mean that suddenly you will develop like this meta intelligence, but that in itself makes a difference if people are thinking and acting ecologically.
Yeah, thank you for that analogy. And in that way, do we feel that an intervention in regards to that mediation by something like a party or more specifically a vanguard party is actually a detriment to that ecology working together, right? Like you said, you know, to use the soccer metaphor, if you just have one person trying to control the team, it can almost be counterintuitive in regards to that in creating dissonance. Do we feel that could pose counterpose a danger to the actual supposed cooperation that it's trying to, various parties or vanguard parties are trying to create or put forward? I'd be curious to hear Assad's thoughts on this.
You know, I have thoughts on questions like that, but I want to pose a different question, because
Go for it.
I understand this ecology today, because today we have these strikes happening, and you know, there's the Instacart strike, and I would like to hear about what kinds of organizational processes have been happening leading up to that. And I know that Sarah, you've been studying this, so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we do have a question from the audience in regards to that. Yeah, it was just how our Instacart work is organizing. For Instacart and more broadly, how are gig workers and others in retail sectors linking up, which is a great example of the kind of platform-based organizing you were talking about earlier about, Sarah, which is its own, you know, its own ecology. How is that all working together? I would be interested in hearing that as well.
Sure. So like I alluded to in my opening remarks, a lot of this organizing is happening on, you know, WhatsApp, Signal groups, Facebook groups, and that has been the case really since this form of labor emerged. And that's the result, obviously, of these workers, you know, not sharing a common work site, working at asynchronous times and places across vast, you know, spaces. And that form of organizing is still the primary form of organizing that is being used. I spoke recently to Vanessa Bain, who is an Instacart worker and organizer. She's a member of an organizing committee, which is essentially, as she described it, you know, a Signal group, a group of workers who are linked up over Signal and who have been organizing these walkouts in that chat space. I think one thing that's interesting about the most recent walkout that happened last month was that it, for the first time, included in-store shoppers and received support from grocery store employees. So there's actually, Instacart itself is actually divided between people who are technically employees. They are not 1099 workers. They work as shoppers exclusively at specific stores. So they'll do a whole shift just picking groceries at like one Ralph's or one Sprouts. And previous walkouts that had been organized by Instacart had only involved the 1099 workers, the shoppers, who did the shopping and the delivery. But the most recent walkout was actually was organized across these two categories, and also received a great deal of sympathy from grocery store workers who I think are, similarly concerned about, safety around COVID-19, and have similar demands around, protective equipment, receiving hazard pay, things like that. But that type of organizing is, like I said, it continues to happen really in Facebook groups, in chats. And I think we have a lot to learn from that form of organizing, given the way that so many of us find ourselves isolated from one another and having to sort of organize under similar conditions now.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. In regards to that, I mean, we have some follow-up questions in regards to kind of the nature of workers, all of a sudden autonomously taking advantage of what is possible in regards to how they have access to technology and each other, and how much that has changed in the last few months. We have some questions specific to the COLA, or the cost of living adjustment, struggle around UC campuses. And so the question, Sarah, if I don't mean to focus on you specifically, but it's just, it's about COLA. So the question is, can you speak to the role of trade unions, activists, and campus groups and local DSA chapters in the COLA strikes, and maybe do a quick rundown of what that is in regards to that? And there was a follow-up question of were any of the aspects of that considered quote unquote spontaneous, and of these spontaneous aspects, have any become a broader systemic challenge, which also plays into kind of what we were just talking about in regards to the spontaneity of the response to this crisis, and even before the crisis. So if you want to speak to that.
Sure. I think I'll speak to the last part of that question. The strike itself, the timing of the strike itself was spontaneous, in the sense that we had no idea that it was going to happen when it did, the way that it did, and the series of events that led to it. It was very much, no one predicted it. We had a group of people who were involved in organizing around the demand for a COLA that began organizing at the beginning of the academic year. We went on a retreat and tried to come up with an organizing plan for how things were going to unfold over the next several months. And in our minds, we had the possibility maybe of a grading strike happening at the end of spring. And really within the first 2 months, a grading strike just sort of exploded. But I think there was a really interesting relationship there between between sort of spontaneity and organization. I mean, on the one hand, the pressurized conditions that produced the strike were always, there, which, stagnant wages and the rising cost of rent, and really a really serious housing shortage in Santa Cruz, in part because so many properties have been converted into Airbnb rentals. So those conditions were there, but the moment of actually, like the culminating moment where hundreds of people said, really over the course of 72 hours, like, I am not turning in grades next week. That was totally spontaneous. The fact that we had people who had been organizing together, who had worked on the rent control campaign, who were members of DSA and had been involved in DSA organizing, and then were also rank and file members of our union, UAW 2865. The fact that we had that we had that organizational history, and that we were linked into these different organizations that you could say were part of an organizational ecology, I think actually helped to like harness the spontaneity of the strike, but also in some ways were like reshaped by it too. I don't know if that's like a good answer to the question, but those are some thoughts that I have about that.
No, absolutely. That was a great answer. I want to link this, to go back to this idea of spontaneity. I want to go back to a question that I don't know if it got answered earlier. Assad started with as one of his theses in regards to, it's organization all the way down was the quote, and that it's and again, feel free to correct me here. That almost seems counterposed to even the idea of spontaneity, right? That there's a kernel of organization happening somewhere always. And so the question from the audience was, does that claim trivialize political organizations, and is spontaneity not the responses in the gaps and ruptures between organized forms? Assad, what do you think?
I think, this is an extremely complicated question. And I think one thing we can say is that there are more and less adequate forms of organization, first of all. There are forms of organization which are sterile and unable to adapt to changing conditions. And there are forms of organization which arise in particular circumstances, coalesce around a particular problem, and then maybe fade away after a particular demand is won or a particular struggle is over. I mean, these are organizational processes that we see happening all the time. And so when I say that, there's no such thing as spontaneity, I'm trying to make this point that we have to be attentive to actual organizational practices that are always happening and figure out how we can actively construct and orient them towards a lasting form, and one which is capable of making that shift that I'm talking about, from the reactive immediate response to conditions to a structural challenge to the system. I mean, that is the great problem, and that that's not just this is a very difficult theoretical problem in my view, which is to say, is there an expression of the existing forms of organization, the processes that are already taking place in the workplace and so on? Do they develop in an expressive manner into the kind of organization that is able to achieve this structural challenge? Or does there have to be a break in which something new is created? And I am not sure that it's possible to decide between these two positions. I think that they are two ways of perceiving the processes that actually take place, and we kind of have to hold the tension.
Yeah, does anyone have a response to that specific question in regards to answering it? I mean, I know that basically.
Well, can you just restate it, Assad? And then Rodrigo, I think, has an answer, but I just wanted to, could you just restate the alternative?
The one would be in which the already existing organizational processes that are always taking place form the foundation of an organization which has a revolutionary character, or that there has to be a break and something which isn't already part of the fabric of everyday life is introduced, which is capable of mounting that revolutionary challenge. Those are the two views I hold in tension.
Okay, Rodrigo.
Well, I think I don't know if I have the answer to that question, but I have a way of complicating it in relation to the organization spontaneity. Relation, because what the sad statement that it is organization all the way down is simply that I think people make a huge mistake when they conceive organization as, or spontaneity as being the opposite of organization. Spontaneity is not the opposite of organization. Spontaneity describes precisely the emergence of a pattern of organization. So how is a spontaneous walkout organized in a workplace? Someone has the idea, someone talks to another person, they decide, well, let's call a meeting. They call a first meeting, some people come, that's it. That's the process of organization of a spontaneous idea. So it's in this way that for me, there is no distinction between the two things.
Can I just add here a point which Sarah prompted me to think about, which is that we also have to remember, anyone who participates in politics knows sometimes things happen to you and you didn't see them coming. And then you have to figure out how you'll respond to them. And that is organization. You know, that requires organization.
Right. So I think, so yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, the idea that you're getting at is that it's possible for these things to be cooperative. I appreciate Rodrigo making the distinction that spontaneity is not the antithesis to organization. I've been asked to bring up, I didn't want to bring this up because I was one of the lead organizers for it, but I've been asked to bring up the New School student strike example. We just finished a digital student strike that we organized in response to a proposed tuition raise. And we stopped attending classes, and Assad was a very helpful theoretical, we appreciated him lending his theoretical capacity to that. But that was a great example, right? When you were talking about Rodrigo, I in regards to, there was a situation where, as Assad said, politics kind of happened to us. And the organizing of students actually in Parsons, who were photography students, not even from the kind of like radical Marxist tradition of the New School, students who no longer had access to their facilities, said, okay, not only are we not getting a tuition refund, we're getting an increase in tuition, which is complete nonsense. You know, how are we supposed to live, and how are we supposed to take online photography classes now? They organized group chat, WhatsApp, etc., came together incredibly quickly, immediately put together demands, demands from the administration within 24 days, and we ended it yesterday. So it was a, thank you. It's like, I feel like that's an interesting microcosm of kind of everything we're talking about here, right? In regards to the intersection of how does one like now organize in this moment without, you know, we couldn't do a building occupation or anything traditionally. But yeah, I don't know. I thought that was a really interesting example, and I'd be curious to hear if Assad has any like insight or feedback, because obviously you were pretty close to that situation, as was I. But from my perspective, it was a very quick, like, it kind of almost goes back to what I think Rodrigo said earlier in regards to nothing is made of this pandemic except what we make of it. And there was the pandemic created the moment for the consciousness raising among students, and that was a common cause quickly found among each other. I'd be curious if Assad has any thoughts on that. Otherwise, we can move on from that. I was just asked to bring it up.
Well, of course, you know, when the students told me about their idea for a strike, I told them that they have to start a Leninist vanguard party, and that this will be the way to win their demands. And clearly, it was successful. So yes.
Thank you for that.
I wanted to come back to the spontaneity question for a second.
Please, yes.
Just because I'm not sure, and I'm just not sure if I'm thinking about it the same way the others are. I mean, when I think of there is no such thing as spontaneity, what I'm generally thinking of, and this is maybe in even a too pedagogical mode, an essay written by a sociologist 40 some years ago about the Greensboro lunch counter sit-in, and essentially the article is saying, look, it appeared to the media, even to many on the left, that this was spontaneous, but it only appears spontaneous to you because you're ignorant of all of the organizations that were already there in the churches, among Black colleges, among the actual forest students, themselves. And so spontaneity doesn't exist. This is the way I've been thinking of it, because in some ways, Rodrigo, you were pointing to the way that there is a kind of organization in process, which I certainly agree with, but I'm thinking primarily that spontaneity doesn't exist because it's an illusion of those who can't see the kinds of organization that were pre-existing. That, so when Sarah was talking about the student organizing, partly that worked because, let's see, when the event happened in those 72 hours, it worked because so many people had not just one, but many organizational forms that were already able to be, enlisted in that. So anyway, that's just the already existing nature of forms of organization that stand behind and are activated in these events. That's what, maybe that's the way you guys were thinking about there is no such thing as spontaneity too. But anyway, I was, and I'm also sort of stuck with the literature and history of this kind of statement too. Okay, that didn't go anywhere. I was just
no, that was
let it drop.
I agree with you, Michael. I think that Rodrigo has described one aspect of what this means, and you were describing another aspect. Rodrigo has pointed out when such a thing, what seemed like a spontaneous walkout happened, somebody talked to somebody. There were various processes happening, which are organizational processes, even if we can't recognize them as that. The other point is that there are sedimented organizational practices and forms from a whole history. And at UC Santa Cruz, I was there, Sarah and I intersected for a couple of years, I think. And of course, before I got there, there was a whole series of occupations and strikes and so on. And that legacy continued and was reactivated in these moments. And you give the great example, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, there are these practices stretching back to the Communist Party, to various Black nationalist organizations and so on, which established this basis. And there is, the example of the various traditions in Italy, of course, where where I'm drawing this slogan. But then also there is this question, which is, Sarah really struck me with it, which is just that sometimes these things just happen. And, I don't want to call it spontaneity in the sense that I do want to recognize that there are always these organizational processes, but there's also an unpredictable character to politics. And how do these events happen? What do we do when we're waiting for them to happen? How do we orient ourselves towards them when they do happen? These, I think, are major political questions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm trying to keep an eye on time. We got a few minutes left. I'd like to maybe wrap it up with one question here, and then after we get in everyone's responses, pass it to Philip. But we have a pretty broad question that you guys can address to whatever extent you want. But it says the shape of the post-pandemic organization will be contingent in the shape of the economic crisis and various state responses to the crisis. Basically, the question says, what do you think the forms of organization and struggle will take post virus. I would posit that, obviously that's such a broad question. The addendum I would add to that is like, let me figure out how to formulate this. Within the context of everything we've been talking about in regards to like these ecologies, is just where do you see that going? Where do you see things changing, either permanently or temporarily? And how do you see this, I would say permanently impacting the landscape of organizing and what that will look like in the future from your perspective? Let's hear from Sarah first, but I would like to hear from everyone.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think about immediately is the impact that I'm imagining this is going to have on tenant organizing. I mean, millions of people are currently unable to pay rent. No wages, no rent. But there are also, in cities like New York and LA and San Francisco, I would say fairly robust tenants organizations, Oakland as well, that are, and sort of tenant advocacy groups and housing groups that I think are contributing to, but will not necessarily determine a new wave of tenant struggles that I can imagine continuing, long after this is over, however we want to put it. I imagine that will be a real lasting outcome.
Great. Rodrigo. You're on mute.
Could you repeat the question, because you were breaking when you were asking it?
Oh, so sorry. For sure. Basically, what do you think where do you see the future of organization and organizing struggles? How do you see that, being permanently or potentially altered by the current situation? What do you see on the other side of this organizationally?
Well, I think the first question is, where is the other side of this, right? I think one of the first battlefields in the response to this crisis is, there are several people who have a direct interest in trying to sell the idea that a return to normality is just around the corner. And I think actually it's likely that we're going to be living in a new world, if not permanently, if the world hasn't changed completely yet, but at least we'll be living in a very different version of the world that we knew until recently for a year, maybe 2 years, maybe more. So that was a problem I had a little bit with the way that the questions were framed for the event, because it was all about what happens afterwards. Well, what happens afterwards is now. We have to fight over what happens afterwards now, because we don't know when afterwards is going to be. The one thing that comes to my mind immediately in response to this question, and here I think I'm thinking mostly of the Brazilian context, is I hope that this is going to force social movements here to think more strategically about how they mobilize people through other means than just calling people out on the streets. So thinking more attentively about the use of data, about setting up permanent communication channels with supporters, creating organizational channels online, because one of the things that happened in recent years is we found out the hardest possible way that the far right were much ahead of us in that department, And maybe the fact that right now we can't organize on the streets, we can't organize in workplaces, will have the positive effect of making people think more strategically about these things.
Great, thank you. Michael.
I was going to say, and maybe I'll just say this quick, what I was really saying at the beginning, which is I think one of the things that's happening now, and was already existing before the crisis, and will continue, is thinking about labor struggles in a more, in an increasingly plural way, like I was saying earlier, the question about organizing logistical struggles like Uber and Amazon workers is already something that was existing and a problem before, and we're seeing it pursued now. Questions about social reproduction too, but then also the linking of labor struggles or wage labor struggles with unwaged labor struggles, and labor struggles with non-labor struggles, like the questions about evictions or others. I think that this kind of multiplicity of it, I don't know if that's a better way of putting it, is necessary coming out of this. But I wanted to, that was just what I wanted, though, to return to something Rodrigo was just saying, and maybe you could either clarify or help me think through it, Rodrigo, which is that maybe I feel stuck or old-fashioned, that I really can't understand, but I recognize this is a problem myself. So why don't you help me? The efficacy of movements without being together. I feel like the virus has taken away the social. And I'm kind of feeling a kind of mourning for the social, and also an inability to think about transformative social struggles without it. So anyway, but you, Rodrigo, I think we're saying, this is what is that the virus will help us recognize the possibility of an efficacy of transformative struggles that don't require that being together. Is my understanding right?
Not quite.
Okay.
I was thinking more about it would help people think more strategically about how they bring people into the struggle, and how they remain in touch with people in the absence of many opportunities for gathering people. I think in the long term, yes, if we're all stuck in our houses forever from now on, not only will that be incredibly sad, but also probably doesn't bode very well for the prospects for transformative politics. But I think it will give, especially because I come from a context here in Brazil where I grew up hearing people say the streets will decide this, this is all decided in the streets. And actually, quite often we've managed to take people out to the streets, and the streets on their own don't do the magic. So it's thinking about, well, how do you, what are the other layers, or what are the other mediations you need in order to make those moments of assembly actually, to turn them into something transformative?
Michael, do you feel like that was clarified?
Totally good. Yeah, terrific. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. And let's hear from Assad.
So I feel like there's a great deal of humility that's necessary in answering this question, because we don't know what kind of social economic restructuring is to come. We don't know whether we will see a new Keynes or Roosevelt or Hitler. We don't know what direction there is out of this. And, you know, capitalism has survived before and transformed and changed the terrain. And I think there is a distinct possibility of capitalism persisting in a climate, you know, of catastrophe in a literal sense. And so we have to confront this possibility, and I am not sure how we respond to what you've described, Michael, as this kind of it's precisely in the term social distancing. We are at a distance from the social, not only distant from each other. And so then what is the basis for a social movement? And I don't know what the answer is, but I know what I think I know is that in the actions that we take now, we have to constantly be affirming the possibility of mobilizing an emancipatory politics. That is, that whatever forms we experiment with, and they may be electoral campaigns, they may be the various kinds of coalitions among different kinds of workers at the level of production and reproduction and so on. But they all have to be oriented towards, I think, producing a new kind of unity which is of an emancipatory politics that forecasts the possibility of overcoming capitalism. Is it possible? I don't know, but nevertheless, we should commit to it.
Beautiful. Great. Thank you so much, Assad, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm gonna go ahead and throw it to Philip, who I think will do kind of a wrap up and pitch for Red May. Philip, you're on mute.
Okay, I would like to thank Assad, Michael, Sarah, and Rodrigo, and Keaton for moderating. And there's certainly a lot to think about. And we've almost returned circuitously to the notion of mutual aid, which we started with. There's a sense in which mutual aid is not only a form, but a content that we're offering against competition, which is, we see how it fails totally around us, or at least we see, and we think it's so naked that everybody must be seeing it. But as Rodrigo said, that assumption is not necessarily true. Everybody has been normed through neoliberalism into this notion that competition is bracing and ultimately makes one a better person and so forth. And we're trying to get out of that and offer a different vision of cooperation and mutual aid. But there are enough examples of that around in the way that people have responded, I think, to who are essential workers and what kind of work they're doing, as opposed to these Schumpeterian entrepreneurs who are supposedly providing models for our behavior into the future. So we will see if only connect as our motto of putting these various struggles that are occurring, we can combine the uneven struggles. That is our task, comrades, in this large vertical party that I want to found today, that I would like you all to be members, and you can be the officers. And okay, enough of that. Well, but let me do my pitch for Red May here. We have a month of events, which we put together in 2 weeks. The Live Red May took 6 months to put together, and in a panic, we put together something that I'm really looking forward to. We depend on your kindness. You can find us at www.redmayseattle.org. There's a donate button there, and look at it, click on it, do whatever you will. And tomorrow, come by and see House Arrest into the hidden abode of women's work with Kathy Weeks, Kathleen Reeves, Liza Featherstone, and Jenny Brown. So thank you.
Great. Thanks again, everyone. Great.
You guys can hang in the room for a second if you